Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and let me just give you a preview for next hour, because right about now there is a kind of a national forum talking about the fact that our democracy is in peril, or democracy's in crisis. Washington Post says democracy dies in darkness. And next hour I want to kind of lead you through a conversation where you can participate as well on what we think are the real issues for a democracy. First of which is we're a republic, not a democracy, but we'll leave that aside. And that is, our elite leaders are telling us that it's all sorts of issues that I think most of our public opinion polls say those are not the issues you think that are important. And if this is supposed to be a representative democracy or a republic, we're going to work our way through that. So you might grab something to write with, and we'll work our way through that in the next hour. Also going to be talking about this issue, border security. I posted an article on critical race theory, how even Hispanic students don't like what is being taught right now in these ethnic study programs. We have a new survey out on, and really probably one of the most effective surveys and studies ever done by Johns Hopkins University on the impact of the lockdowns. It's not good. And I thought before we're done, next hour we'll talk about Whoopi Goldberg. Whether you're trying to cancel Joe Rogan, whether you think that Whoopi Goldberg should be pulled off the air, we believe in free speech, and I think what was done to her because of some things she said that I disagree with, but certainly she has the right to say them in an opinion kind of program, even if she said them in a very poor way. I just think we'll talk about those issues, and we've posted some articles related to that. But this first hour, I want to help you with an area of ministry. We're first going to talk about the ministry to cancer patients, and then we will get to our conversation that we were trying to have the other day with Ryan Bomberger, who is with Radiance Foundation, and that will get us into the issue of adoption. So if you're in a ministry, or you're a pastor, or a Sunday school teacher, or you know individuals that would benefit from that, we want to try to educate you in these areas, because we want you to be effective in your ministry. Let's first of all bring to the microphone Rev Percy McCray. He is an individual that has spent more than 2 decades ministering to cancer patients and caregivers at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, but also oversees what is called our Journey of Hope, and is the director of these faith-based programs at the Cancer Treatment Centers of America. So, Reverend McCray, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, for having me. How are you, sir?
Very good. We have a link to your website, and the first thing it talks about is this care ministry. But I'd love to hear your story about how you came to actually work in this area of ministering to cancer patients.
Yeah, over 20 plus years ago now, May of this year be 26. I was fresh out of Bible college and was preparing to transition back to my local hometown of Chicago, looking to start my own church and ministry, and had a very serendipitous opportunity that was presented to me by an organization called Cancer Treatment Centers of America, who were looking for a director of pastoral care for their chaplaincy program inside of the local hospital there, and was not very familiar with the chaplaincy work, and certainly not working with cancer patients at all. Sat down, had a conversation, and one thing led to another. I was provided an opportunity to basically create a robust internal spiritual support program for patients of faith who believed that their faith was as important as good clinical medical care, but did not want to have to substitute one for the other. And that's where my career began. And here I am almost 26 years later, now a 2-year cancer survivor myself, have ministered to over, thousands of cancer patients, have started cancer care ministries at about 3,000 churches internationally. I have my own podcast that we interview cancer patients and doctors and about the process and the conversation of cancer, faith, and wellness. So here I am today, sir.
Let me just mention that podcast. Very well done. First of all, you work with Wayne Shepherd. I've known Wayne Shepherd for lots and lots of decades. We go way, way back, and that is part of the Health, Hope, and Inspiration podcast. We have a link to that, healthhopeandinspiration.com. You don't have to type all that out. We have all of that on our website. Of course, we also have information about Rev Percy McCray and all sorts of issues related to that, as well as you can click on another button that says Our Journey of Hope. And I think it might be helpful for people to understand that this is not something where people have to reinvent the wheel. I know that we have listeners right now that are seminary students, graduates of seminaries, maybe graduates of Bible colleges, pastors, Sunday school teachers, and the rest. And you actually have a ministry training program which was created because of such a need. I mean, we have, 16, almost 17 million Americans that have a history of cancer, include even our people in our own ministry here. So it's something that we desperately need to provide training for, and that's something you do provide, isn't it?
That is correct. According to the American Cancer Society, 30% plus Americans are estimated to be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lifetime in America. And so to your point, this is a real issue and conversation that needs to be held and had by the faith community. And the whole objective here, when I started this program, I was led by the Spirit of God based upon a conversation that I had with one of our patients who asked me to sit down and talk to her pastor and a group of pastors in his consortium to kind of share some of the things that we were doing internally at Cancer Treatment Centers of America with regard to ministry to cancer patients, that many churches and ministries simply do not have an emphasis, a focus, or even a understanding of how to minister effectively to cancer patients, and not because of any ill intent, but because of simply lack of knowledge. And so we started this program. It is free of charge. OurJourneyOfHope.com, where representatives of local churches and faith groups can attend a 2 free-day training seminar where we will provide you with all of the training materials and curriculum, online support materials that will enable one to go back into their local faith community and start their very own cancer care ministry that will help them to understand the mental, emotional, and obviously some of the physical dynamics of treatment and care, and how to be more present and intentional with those that are sitting inside of your local church. If you pay attention to the local church prayer roll, there is always someone on it that has cancer.
Oh,
so
yes.
Cancer is very real. Even now, many of our pastors and spiritual leaders, Kerby, have become very vocal and public about their cancer journey. Dr. Tony Evans and his wife, as an example, Louis Palau, who, recently passed away because of cancer. So this is a real conversation in the faith community that we simply cannot continue to ignore. The Bible says that my people are destroyed because of lack of knowledge, but not Our Journey of Hope trained cancer ministers and ministries that are being empowered throughout the United States.
Very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about briefly why is cancer different. But just again, think of your own church. If you're in a church with, say, 200 people, that means maybe 8 people are living with cancer. If you're in a church, maybe a large church with 2,000 people, that means 80 people are living with cancer. So this is not a small issue. It's significant. That's why we're talking about it today here on Point of View. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The president and vice president have been delivering speeches that effectively argue that America has significant numbers of domestic enemies. They aren't talking about Antifa or Muslim radicals. They are talking about American citizens and state legislatures. Two recent speeches illustrate the point. On the anniversary of January 6th, the president and vice president compared the Capitol riot to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attack on 9/11. This was supposedly the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Later that month, the president and vice president flew to Atlanta to rail against election integrity laws, which he described as voter suppression and previously labeled as Jim Crow 2.0. He asked the crowd, "Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace?" The typical response to all this rhetorical flourish is that the president and vice president are merely engaged in hyperbole. They don't really believe this. But here's a scary question. What if they do believe it? What if they truly believe their own narrative that the country is engaged in an existential struggle against domestic forces in America? What if they really do believe that they need to marshal the power of the federal government against large portions of the American people who they believe should be labeled domestic terrorists? My commentary yesterday talked about Attorney General Merrick Garland's memorandum describing protesting parents as domestic terrorists, and the Biden Justice Department has announced that it was forming a new domestic terrorism unit. These actions suggest that they do believe the country is facing a greater threat from domestic enemies than any we've faced in 150 years. Pundits and politicians need to ask this administration what they believe about domestic terrorism and ask them to define who they feel is a domestic enemy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation with Rev Percy McCray for a few more minutes. Again, working with the Cancer Treatment Centers of America. Also, ourjourneyofhope.com, which is one of the links that we have there, as well as, of course, we have a link to his podcast and many other resources. But Reverend McCray, for just a minute, some people might be thinking, okay, this is really good that you're actually doing a ministry to people with cancer, but everybody gets sick, and so what's the difference? Is there anything different about a cancer diagnosis compared to other kinds of diagnosis, and what are some specifically unique things that you do when you actually are ministering to people that have cancer?
It's a great question. I think the top of the list issue is that the historic reputation of cancer has been it's a killer, and cancer certainly is a dangerous disease that once upon a time, certainly took many lives. And one of the great things that I've had the privilege of understanding and learning over, almost 2 decades in this environment is that the death rate of cancer has gone down precipitously to the tune of about 30% over the last 20 years. And so cancer is no longer the death threat that it once was, that more people are living and thriving and surviving with a diagnosis of cancer than any time ever before. But yet its reputation still lingers in the consciousness of people that then creates a paralyzation and a polarization when people hear the term and therefore kind of freeze or stop or even will allow the spirit of fear to overtake them that doesn't allow them to fight back. And so this is why fundamentally the local church has to get engaged and involved with this conversation and with this fight and have a dedicated ministry for it. Some of the specific things that we outline in our curriculum to address the unique dynamics of cancer is obviously first and foremost the mental and emotional dynamics of people working through theologically an issue of, do I have cancer because I was out the will of God, or did I sin? Is there something that I did that basically perpetuated and allowed myself to be attacked by cancer? This is a huge theological debate and conversation that, quite frankly, in my personal opinion, the faith community has gotten wrong, and we need to readjust our filter and the way that we react and respond, because for those who survive cancer, those who have gotten on the other side of cancer did not do so by accident. There had to be an intentional and a deliberate kind of undertaking that, first and foremost, people were freed up from the fact that if I'm trusting and believing God to empower me, how can I do that if I'm also dealing with a God who judged me or placed cancer upon me because of something that I did? It's a contradiction. It's an oxymoron. And more importantly, it psychologically divides a patient from being able to rally and marshal the needed forces to be singly focused on the things that are in their control and the things that they need to do in order to move beyond the mental, emotional, and physical rigors of cancer treatment.
Very good. Take us through what happens in this 2-day seminar, because some may be listening right now and they say, I'm a deacon in my church, or I'm maybe an individual that is a pastor who's actually involved in various kinds of hospice and other kinds of care, and I might be interested in this, or a pastor or other individuals, maybe even a qualified layperson. It's a 2-day cancer care leadership training. Can you kind of take us through what that entails and how people can sign up for it if they're interested?
Absolutely. First and foremost, on day one, we do an overview and an introduction of what is cancer. I think the biggest dynamic and hurdle for people to overcome is just the lack of understanding, some basic dynamics of what cancer is, how it operates, some terminology, those sorts of things, to familiarize one with the actual landscape of this enemy. You cannot fight an enemy who you do not understand or who you are not willing to confront because of ignorance. And so we try to unpack some of the mystery around cancer from a clinical perspective to give people a layman's and working understanding of such. We provide them with data and research to help substantiate, again, the important factors that needs to be understood with regard to rates of treatment, types of care plans, types of things that can be done. And as we all should be aware of the fact that cancer treatment continues to proliferate and accelerate from a technological perspective. So we are providing this audience who are not clinically based, obviously they're theologically based, with some groundwork to be able to stand upon in terms of understanding what this disease is and how to approach it and what are the clinical opportunities and definitions. And so that's part of day one. And then we obviously allow that group to kind of engage a little bit with each other to understand what motivated them to actually want to participate in something like this. So people kind of give their stories and help people to understand how universal the impact of cancer is. This is not an individual sport. Cancer is a community disease that impacts all of us directly or indirectly, so that we can lower the wall of silence and fear around cancer only happened to me or my mom or what have you. Then we delve into 8 specific chapters that deal specifically with important topics. Number one of those topics is how to care for the caregiver. You cannot properly minister to cancer patients if you are not aware and attuned and tied into their caregiver, because caregivers play a very important role, but they're often left out. They are not acknowledged and not supported. And so we talk about how to care for the caregiver. Know your enemy. We talk about how to address and deal with the issue of fear. These are the topics that we go through systematically, and then we step through the actual setting up of a cancer care ministry. We give people a template and an outline, a format, all of the things that they will need to be able to go, and when they step back into their local congregation, they can open up this one-stop shopping of this box of goodies that will allow them to begin to set up shop internally, how to advertise, how to promote, how to announce their cancer care program, how to create their logo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All has been laid out for them. These are in part and partial the 2 days that will be encompassed, again, free days of training that will equip and empower one to be able to go back to their local community and start as soon as they have the energy and the insight to begin their cancer care ministry.
Let me mention again, we have a link to our journeyofhope.com. And if you are interested in that, or even so, even if you're not, you might know someone that is. If you certainly know somebody that has cancer, and I think all of us do, or you are certainly tied into a church where a pastor might want to know about this, as look down the list, for example, of where the cancer care leadership trainings are taking place. They're in places where we broadcast right now, for example, in Arizona, in Illinois, in Georgia, and other places. So you can actually find one that may be located near you. You might even be able to host one. And so I know you're going to want to find out all this information. And you may even want to interact with, of course, the pastor here, because we also have a link to his website. And maybe you would like to get his podcast, which is, again, healthhopeandinspiration.com. Again, you don't have to remember all that because we have a link there, and you can listen to some of the recent programs, some of the most popular episodes, and all of that is available on the website. So when people go there, you're willing to answer questions that people might have. If somebody has cancer, or they are trying to minister to someone who has cancer, and they say, I need somebody that's been down the road a little bit, you're available to answer those questions, aren't you?
Absolutely. I've certainly joined people's virtual Zoom groups. Back in the day when we were still traveling and face fronting inside of churches, I would go and speak and do seminars and presentations. So reach out to me and let's see how we can interface, and I will certainly be more than willing to do that, which is feasible to be done to engage your local church and community.
Well, again, say hi to your friend and my friend, Wayne Shepherd. I've known Wayne Shepherd since the days we used to work together at Moody and have followed him ever since. He's actually been in the studio with us, and of course I run into him all the time at the National Religious Broadcasters. So if nothing else, Pastor Percy McCray, we appreciate the fact that you are doing this ministry, but you want to pass it on to others. And so take the time to find out a little bit more about our journey of hope, as well as health, hope, and inspiration. And all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to the next opportunity.
All right, Kirby, I'll see you at the NRB also, my friend. Take care. God bless.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about a different aspect of ministry, and that is adoption. Ryan Bomberger has been with us before, supposed to be with us the other day, and didn't connect up with him, so he is, again, the Chief Creative Officer and co-founder of the Radiance Foundation. I'm going to maybe start by having him tell his story about being adopted, and then let him and his wife, Bethany, talk about how they adopt others. And adoption's always been an issue, but you know what? If abortion, is all of a sudden no longer legal, we're going to really need to emphasize adoption even more so. So I thought it would be appropriate to get him back on the program and talk about this very important ministry of adoption, the issue of abortion, the issue of really just standing up for human life and the sanctity of human life. So we'll spend a little bit of time with him. And the next hour, we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news. Lots to cover. We will do all of that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. Pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
So often on this program, we talk about the sanctity of human life, and I've said before that if you're against something, against abortion, you should be for something as well, and that is for pregnancy resource centers, for adoption, for a number of things, because we do believe that that is also part of the ministry, and that's why we thought it would be good to bring back to the microphone Ryan Bomberger. He is the Chief Creative Officer and also the co-founder of Radiance Foundation, which he founded with his wife Bethany, who's the executive director. You might be familiar with the podcast Life Has Purpose, and that is certainly a theme that runs through the Radiance Foundation. Also, of course, his book, Not Equal, Civil Rights Gone Wrong, and he joins us now once again. Ryan, thank you for joining us again on Point of View.
Hey, it's great to be here with you.
Let's, if we can, maybe tell your story, because it's been a while since we've had you on, but you were both adopted in an incredible story there, but then you and your wife also have adopted. So when you are encouraging us to stand for life and adopt children, you've been through the whole process, haven't you?
You could say a full circle sort of experience for me. So it's interesting when people ask me, especially as a guy, why do you even care about this? Well, one, because I'm human, so every one of us should care about the issue of abortion, the injustice of abortion. But I would say that my passion began just out of my own story. I was adopted, as you mentioned, into a small little family of 15. I have 6 brothers, 6 sisters, 10 of us were adopted. But I'm that fringe example that a lot of people have a hard time with when it comes to discussions about abortion. Inevitably gets to that question, well, what about rape? Well, I'm part of that whole question and part of that answer. I'm the 1% that's used 100% of the time to justify abortion.
Yes.
So my birth mom experienced the horror and the violence of rape, but she courageously chose life and gave me the incredible gift of adoption, which is why I'm now an adoptive dad with 4 kiddos, and I have two of my 4 are adopted. All 4 of them are loved like crazy. And I will say I had a great role model as a father. My dad, Henry Bomberger, was the most amazing man I've ever known. He deeply loved us all, and anyone he ever came into contact with, and he was deeply loved. He passed away a year ago. Just want to say this, a year ago, from January 22nd, the tragic anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And my dad was the kind of man who loved those that others abandoned, and he embodied what it meant to be pro-life. He lived it out every single day. So that's why I have this whole perspective. That's why I have a God perspective on the value of every human life, because I got that from my dad. I got that from my mom, and they loved us all like crazy.
And I might just mention that you actually have a fund that you have named in honor of your parents, and that I think is very encouraging. So you can find out more when you go to the radiancefoundation.org. But talk about this idea of adoption. We've always needed adoptive agencies. We've always needed to emphasize this. But I think many of us around the table are beginning to think that we may get to a point where Roe versus Wade will not be legal, and all sorts of abortion-minded women who were convinced that the only answer to their problem was abortion now might think twice or might consider adoption. So we need to really start gearing up the body of Christ to be ready, don't you think?
100%. And it's actually tragic to me as a Christian to think of how many misconceptions there are about adoption in the church. I mean, I spoke at an event, this is several years ago, 2 years ago, where the sponsoring organizations, they were all Christian organizations, and the president of one of those organizations said, I'm really concerned about the keynote speakers, which was my wife and I, Bethany and I, and we're concerned about the focus on adoption. Adoption isn't biblical. And I'm thinking, have you cracked open your Bible? What do you mean adoption isn't biblical? It's the essence of salvation.
Yes.
So here you had a Christian leader who apparently had a really warped understanding of what adoption is. I mean, in the natural and the supernatural, adoption happens because of brokenness, and it brings restoration and healing. And as all, healing is a process. Doesn't mean that it's instantaneous, but I'm so grateful that I was adopted. I'm so grateful that I'm an adoptive dad. But it's amazing how many misunderstandings and how many myths we have to still bust in just the church alone when it comes to adoption. As far as numbers, for instance, there are lots of people say, well, people of my complexion who are brown, they're not being adopted out of the foster care system. Yes, they are. We're disproportionately represented, but a lot of that has to do with the tragic focus on race, which is only increasing, and that's not coming from the adoptive families. That's coming from the system that believes that you can only place children of the same color with parents of the same color, and that's disastrous. But the church really needs to wake up. There are about 60,000 children in the foster care system that still remain unadopted, that are able to be adopted because their parental rights have been severed, but they're still waiting for a home. I mean, it only takes, I think, less than one family out of 17% of evangelical churches to choose to adopt, and we would wipe out that list of children waiting to be loved by a mom and a dad.
And again, I so appreciate you speaking to those issues because, again, sometimes the argument is, well, they won't adopt children of color or ones with disabilities. Of course, if you know anything about the family into which you were adopted, all of the above there. But also, it's worth mentioning that as you go to the radiancefoundation.org, you're going to find out about some of the books. I'm going to talk about those in just a minute, but I thought we'd mention the articles because you wrote one recently, My Family is the Realization of Dr. King's Dream. And since we find ourselves in Black History Month at the moment, you also have one that has just come out, 5 Crucial Lessons Mainstream Media Won't Give You for Black History Month. So you are really addressing this issue generally, but you also have been given a wonderful platform with our African-American listeners as well, haven't you?
Yes, and I'm grateful for that. I am grateful as someone who is both black and white to be able to carry out what I feel like is part of my calling, and that is to reconcile. And that is to bring people together, to actually celebrate those things that unite us instead of focusing on the things that divide us. And I say that not pretending that we don't acknowledge certain parts of history, that we don't acknowledge certain parts of the present, but the only way to bring about unity is through love. And that's the biblical perspective, and that's what I try to bring to people of every hue, beautiful hue and color out there. So
let's talk about some of the resources and the books and things that you might be able to provide. One of those, of course, is your book, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But I did want to give a shout out to your wife because she has Pro-Life Kids and some other resources that would be very good in educating our children and grandchildren about these pro-life issues. Can you talk about that?
100% my favorite author. I'm a little biased, but Bethany, she's a teacher by profession. She taught for, over 14 years in both public and private schools, and now a homeschool educator. We actually live in Loudoun County, by the way. I'm sure your listeners have heard of Loudoun County, Virginia, and we are actually fighting what's going on in those schools. But my wife has been an educator for a long time and is really passionate about instilling an age-appropriate pro-life worldview for children. And our book, Pro-Life Kids, you can get it at prolifekids.com. It really is a beautifully illustrated children's book written in rhyme that actually not only imparts that life has purpose, it also gives 10 practical ways that kids can be pro-life in their area. But there's no book out there like this. And as an educator, she was so frustrated that she felt like there weren't tools for parents who she felt were waiting way too long to teach their kids a pro-life worldview. Some would approach her, would say, well, my kid's 13 or 14. Should I take them to the March for Life? And we're thinking, you should take them to the March for Life when they're 2 and 3 and 4. The rest of the world is out there screaming a lie, while we as Christians, as pro-life Christians, often remain silent. And we can't do that. We have to teach our kids before a broken world reaches them, and that's why Bethany wrote Pro-Life Kids.
And, of course, you have written Not Equal, Civil Rights Gone Wrong, and, of course, you're right there in Ground Zero, Loudoun County. The podcast, Life Has Purpose, but also, can you speak to that issue? Because you've been addressing this issue of critical race theory, you've been addressing this issue of Black Lives Matter, and it's another platform that I think God has provided for you.
Absolutely. I mean, being here in Loudoun County, it would be impossible to not understand what's going on in our schools. And so while they're denying that they're teaching critical race theory, they can give it any euphemism they want: social emotional learning, culturally responsive teaching. I mean, they give it all kinds of euphemisms. It's the same garbage. It's the same divisive sort of rhetoric. It's not even just divisive. It's so toxic, talking about the confusion of sexuality, talking about, of course, you can't be anti-racist unless you're also pro-feminist, which means you're also pro-abortion, which means you're also pro-LGBT. And this is all the content that is being being forced on our children in public schools. So this is why we're fighting here in Loudoun County, because one, parents should be instrumentally involved in their child's education, whereas the school, and especially from a CRT perspective, believe that the parents are the enemies. In fact, they were teaching, some of our friends are teachers in this school system. They're showing us some of the training materials, saying that the teacher is the second parent. The parents are subject, and the parent's role is actually subordinate to the teachers. I'm like, no, you've got it wrong. We are the primary influencers, which is why I love that the Governor Youngkin here in Virginia, with this recent change last November politically, is saying, no. Parents are the ones who have the right to decide how their child will be educated. That primary responsibility is the parents. It's not the bureaucrats. It's not the schools. And so this is part of this fight that we're trying to engage in here, and to stop this severing that's happening from the schools. They're trying to sever the relationship between parents and students.
We'll take a break. And by the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some calls right after these messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Ryan Bomberger. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talking with him about the Radiance Foundation, which we have on our website, theradiancefoundation.org. Of course, we've mentioned his book, Not Equal, Civil Rights Gone Wrong. Not to mention, I think you would certainly want to link into his podcast, Life Has Purpose. But also, you might think about scheduling him as a speaker because, first of all, he can address issues like abortion and adoption and critical race theory and racial reconciliation and so many other issues that are there. So again, those resources are available, and I believe that you are available to come and speak, and everybody's been hearing about Loudoun County, so to get perspective from somebody who's been in the midst of it to talk about what they can do in their community would be just another aspect of a way in which you can minister to some of our listeners.
Absolutely. It's just one of the many ways we reach out creatively through the Radiance Foundation to highlight that life has purpose. And there's something about personal experience when you've come into contact with so many of these different issues. You know, it's a blessing to be able to speak about them. It really is.
One of the callers that couldn't stay on the line wanted to know if you've still been in contact with your birth mother and how that's played out, because it's something when we talk about adoption, sometimes people wonder if you go back and find your background or whether that's something where you decided to move on.
No, I've actually never come into contact with my birth mom. I did search for her years ago, and the search came up negative in that there was no response. So I'm not even sure if she's alive, but I understand, obviously, with the circumstances that she had to endure, that some would choose perhaps not to respond. But at this point, I've never contacted her. In fact, I did just write an op-ed that's appeared in several news outlets. It's on our website as well, called Dear Birth Mom. And I just write a thank you note, thank you letter to her. I pray one day I get to meet her face-to-face. I would love to thank her, but at this point, I've not contacted her or been contacted by her.
If you go to the radiancefoundation.org, it's actually posted in November, and it's Dear Birth Mom. It's really quite touching about what you have done. And if nothing else, Ryan, you are one of many people that we've done interviews with over the years who are a product of rape. And of course, you know the argument that is always given that, well, it would have been better if those people had not been given life. And I have said before, when people bring this up, I've sat across the table. In this case, I'm doing it with you by phone, but I've actually sat across the table with a number of individuals that came in this world because of the most horrific set of circumstances, because of rape. And it's hard for me to look them in the eyes and say, well, you should have been aborted. And once you kind of use that argument, it helps people think, yeah, we are still dealing with a human being here that, given the opportunity, will have a phenomenal ministry. And some of these individuals I've interviewed have, like you, have had a phenomenal ministry, and yet they came into the world through the most horrific of circumstances.
Exactly. And people need to remember, look, none of us control the circumstances of our conception. If they did, that would be really weird. So that doesn't happen. But the circumstances of our conception never change the condition of our worth. And as Christians, we should see that. And we would see that if we look through, instead of the broken lens of the world, and, you know, you fill in the blank, the broken lens of race, the broken lens of gender, the broken lens of whatever, fill in the blank. But if we look through the breakthrough filter of Christ, we see our fellow human beings very differently, and we see their circumstances differently. And that's what I'm hoping I'm a testament to, that you can't possibly know what someone will become. Even if they achieve nothing, their worth is still equal. Because our worth comes from God. It doesn't come from our circumstances. It doesn't come from man or woman.
And again, let me just, before I run out of time, mention one other thing. I'd be remiss if I hadn't pointed out that I think it was back in 2015, if I remember right, you were sued by the NAACP. By the way, they lost. But I think it's illustrative, again, that even before we had all the racial tension, George Floyd, the racial conflict, even what's going on right now with critical race theory, there were attempts to try to shut down some of the things you were doing years ago, from all things the NAACP. Can you speak to that for a minute?
That was insane. That was so surreal. We placed billboards in the San Francisco Bay Area, about 60 of them, that said Black and Beautiful, TooManyAborted.com, and we were dealing with the hugely disproportionate impact of abortion in the black community. And so ACLU came out, denounced us, Planned Parenthood denounced us, which you're obviously doing something right if those two organizations are denouncing you. But then the NAACP came out and said that our campaign was racist, and it gave the false impression that Planned Parenthood kills black babies. Well, they kill black babies, white babies, and every hue in between, over 345,000 every year. So they sued us. They threatened to financially ruin us because I wrote an article, being the factivist that I am, I wrote an article and I called it the National Association for the Abortion of Colored People. So if they didn't like it, they sued me. And as you mentioned, it was 2 years in federal court. Thank thanks to Alliance Defending Freedom, who represented us, who protected our rights against a civil rights organization, we did prevail. We lost on the first federal court level, but then we won on an appeal, and it's such a surreal experience for a brown guy to be sued by the NAACP for exercising my most basic civil rights to life. Freedom of speech.
It just illustrates again that, as I've said before, one of the things we're going to need here in the 2020s, if you will, is courage. And there are cancel culture aficionados everywhere, and there are lawsuits everywhere. And of course, every Friday we usually try to have somebody from First Liberty on this program, but we also have people in the past from Alliance Defending Freedom and others. And that's why these organizations exist, because sometimes when you step out and say some things that are not seen as politically correct and contradict the views, for example, of Planned Parenthood and a variety of other organizations, you can be sued. But it's amazing that it was an NAACP suit, not a Planned Parenthood suit. But nevertheless, you prevailed, and it's just a good illustration of we need to be courageous, we need to be forthright, we need to speak the truth in love. But you have certainly been willing to do that. So as people connect to the radiancefoundation.org, if they'd like to have you come and speak, if they'd like to know more about your podcast, maybe get one of the books we've mentioned or read some of your articles, talk about what's available for our listeners when they land on your website.
You'll see the content that we create, whether they're videos, the memes, lots of infographics. We're just deep into research, so you'll see our op-eds that link to a lot of primary information. It's just really, really helpful. We just believe in factivism, so you'll see a lot of creative content when you go to Radiance Foundation, and a lot of great stuff to share on social media to start the conversations that we all need to be having.
Well, again, we so gratefully appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to the next opportunity, and go to, again, Radiance Foundation to find all of those resources. So thank you, Ryan. Look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks so much.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of democracy in peril, or democracy in crisis, whatever you want to call it, because there has been some very good pieces. Matter of fact, this one by Victor Davis Hanson, Joe Biden and the use of nihilism, but you could even simply say the political and media elites in the use of nihilism. But I want to get into that for just a minute, because there is so much being said right now about the democracy in our country. First of all, it's a republic, but okay, that's the phrase he used. The democracy is in peril. Democracy is in crisis. Washington Post has this line, the democracy dies in darkness. And so it's the idea that right now we have a major crisis. And I think most of you listening to this program would agree, but you wouldn't agree with what the elites are suggesting is the crisis. You recognize there's a crisis, but it's almost no connection between what they say and what you believe. And I want to show that to you. So if you can, get a piece of paper and something to write with, pencil, paper, pen, whatever. And maybe you may make a list like I'm going to make a list. And then I'm even going to suggest that you might want to photograph it and post it on our Facebook page, or send it as an email, or scan it, or whatever, or even just send it an email, because I'd like to see what you would say. But I think I can illustrate pretty quickly that this conversation has been taking place this last hour on this kind of national public discussion about democracy in peril is identifying a problem, but it has the wrong diagnosis and obviously the wrong solution as well. So the prognosis and the diagnosis and the remedy, they're all off. And we'll explain that right after these important messages.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We're going to get back into some of the issues in the news, and we're going to talk about democracy in just a minute, because that's in the news all the time. That word is probably getting overused, but we'll talk about how to maybe think that through, and I'm even encouraging you to give us some feedback on that regard. But then we'll get into border security. A couple new surveys coming out with that. Of course, we've been talking about these videos that have been circulating, reminding us of what's going on in that regard. A very interesting piece we've posted today on the teaching of critical race theory and how many of the Hispanic students don't like these ethnic studies either. Not surprising, but we'll get into that in just a minute. An incredibly thorough analysis of the impact of the lockdowns from Johns Hopkins University. Now, anytime you talk about experts, you kind of roll your eyes, but really the gold standard always has been the Johns Hopkins University studies, because they have oftentimes been the ones documenting the number of COVID infections, COVID deaths, and all the rest. And they basically found that lockdowns just didn't work. Oh, what a surprise. And before we're done here, I did think I would make a comment or two about Whoopi Goldberg. I was going to do that the other day because I thought, well, again, people are criticizing her, and justly so, because she said some things probably she shouldn't have said. But then we find out last night they decide, at least at ABC, that we're going to suspend her for a couple of weeks. And whether it's Whoopi Goldberg or whether it's Joe Rogan or whether it's all sorts of individuals that we've had on this program, I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, black, white, Asian, whatever you might be, this attempt to just always have this cancel culture and suspend people, especially after they've apologized, I think has gone too far. So though we may disagree with some of the things Whoopi Goldberg says, we defend her right to say them, and especially on an opinion show, which is kind of what The View is. I'm amazed. But nevertheless, let's talk about democracy for just a minute. A lot of it kind of relates to a very good piece out by Victor Davis Hanson when he talks about the government and the uses of nihilism. You might say, okay, nihilism, that's one of those big words. Well, it means the lack of any kind of moral or religious perspective, really kind of almost an idea of meaninglessness. And he's pointing out that we have sort of a pandemic of it right now, where we've thrown out laws and rules and protocols and traditions and everything, and we're paying a price. Everywhere you go, people are talking about democracy, but they are oftentimes talking about the problem of democracy in America. Now, again, as I point out, it's a republic. Matter of fact, if you go to my January 21st commentary, I even point out that the answer to some of the arguments being used right now are, well, this is a republic. That's why we have electoral college. That's why we have representation. That's why we have individuals that are elected for 2 years in the House and 6 years originally supported and appointed by the state legislatures, and why we have a vertical distribution of powers and a horizontal distribution of powers, and on and on and on. But the best way to illustrate the complete disconnect is to, if you have a piece of paper, put on the left side the words maybe leader or elite. Victor Davis Hanson talks about media because he's talking about media elite, political elites, and those kinds of things. And on the right-hand side, put the voting public. And for those of you looking online, maybe on Facebook or whatever, you can see I've already created mine. And I've done this in a way just, I've actually printed it out so you can read it. But I would love to know what you would put, because we don't have to guess on how the leaders, what the leaders think are the most important issues. and what the voting public believes are the most important issues, because the leaders, if they're political leaders, they're giving speeches on it, or if they're media, they're having a coverage of that, they're having headlines on it, and they're making decisions about what will be covered in that newscast or in that newspaper. And on the voting public, we have all sorts of surveys, Gallup surveys, and surveys by Axios and CBS, and all sorts of Rasmussen and the rest. And so if you were to assume that we have a democracy that's working, you would assume that these would be like two circles. Remember those Venn diagrams where there would be just a tremendous amount of overlap? Because after all, the framers intended that we would have representatives that would go and represent our views. But what you find is there's almost no overlap. I broke them down into three categories. What are the social issues that leaders are talking about right now? Well, equity is one of those. Transgender, racial issues are almost always the ones they're focusing on. If you go to the voting public, we know what those are. The top two issues are almost always crime and inflation. And the issue of equity doesn't even show up on any of those surveys. Transgender may be down in single digits. And so there's a complete disconnect between the leaders and what they're talking about right now and the voting public. Well, let's now go to the national level. What about our issues that Congress should address or the president should be addressing? Well, you know what those are. The leaders say, well, that's vaccine mandates and climate change. Climate change, a big issue. Matter of fact, one of my commentaries I got coming out here is on the whole issue of climate change. But if you ask voters what they think Congress should be addressing, one of the top issues is immigration and border security, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes here. And the other one is budget. We just like to get to the point where Congress could live within its means. Congress could finally pass a budget that balances, and so you see the same kind of issue. And then finally, when you look at foreign policy, what's the big issue all the leaders are talking about right now? Well, it's Ukraine, which I thought was kind of interesting. Is the other day there was maybe you've seen this video, Jen Psaki, who is, again, the press secretary. She's doing this kind of Zoom call with some of the individuals that are associated with the school she went to. And at one point she says, no, I'm looking at the screens here, and, you know, all these different news outlets are all talking about Ukraine. And then over here, Fox News is talking about crime. They're just living in an alternative universe. And I'm thinking, no, you're living in an alternative universe. Because when we ask individuals what's our most important, crime, inflation, and immigration, those are big issues. And yet you just think they're living in an alternative universe. If you even ask what are the foreign policy issues that the voting public believe in, well, maybe China, maybe Russia. So anyway, that's my list. I'd love to know what yours is, and maybe what you can do is if you have created a list, maybe write it out and take a screenshot of it, take a picture of it, send it to us, at info@pointofview.net, or put it on Facebook, mail it to us, whatever. I'd love to know what you think, but it's an illustration graphically that shows the incredible disconnect between what are the really important issues that most Americans are dealing with. As we talked about at the end of this last year, a dozen different major cities had the highest homicide rate in history. And some of those cities are not far from where we actually have broadcasts that are heard. The whole issue of immigration, which we'll talk about again in just a minute, is very significant. And yet, again, that sometimes doesn't even get more than a mention, if at all, by the media, even by politicians. And then, of course, inflation. For the longest time, we were being told, well, that's just transitory. But instead, we need to be concerned about equity and climate change and transgender issues and Ukraine, which, quite frankly, I'm not sure how many Americans could find Ukraine on a map. And so you see an incredible disconnect. So even today, as they're talking about democracy in crisis, I agree, but for very different reasons than you're talking about on this national platform. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The president and vice president have been delivering speeches that effectively argue that America has significant numbers of domestic enemies. They aren't talking about Antifa or Muslim radicals. They are talking about American citizens and state legislatures. Two recent speeches illustrate the point. On the anniversary of January 6th, the president and vice president compared the Capitol riot to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attack on 9/11. This was supposedly the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Later that month, the president and vice president flew to Atlanta to rail against election integrity laws, which he described as voter suppression and previously labeled as Jim Crow 2.0. He asked the crowd, "Do you want to be on the side of Dr. King or George Wallace?" The typical response to all this rhetorical flourish is that the president and vice president are merely engaged in hyperbole. They don't really believe this. But here's a scary question. What if they do believe it? What if they truly believe their own narrative that the country is engaged in an existential struggle against domestic forces in America? What if they really do believe that they need to marshal the power of the federal government against large portions of the American people who they believe should be labeled domestic terrorists? My commentary yesterday talked about Attorney General Merrick Garland's memorandum describing protesting parents as domestic terrorists, and the Biden Justice Department has announced that it was forming a new domestic terrorism unit. These actions suggest that they do believe the country is facing a greater threat from domestic enemies than any we've faced in 150 years. Pundits and politicians need to ask this administration what they believe about domestic terrorism and ask them to define who they feel is a domestic enemy. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I would suggest you make a list, and I just, again, held it up so you could see it. But whether you look at my list or your list, I think even as you maybe talk to individuals that over the next couple of months are going to want you to vote for them in public office, you might, as you're listening to them, maybe at a campaign event or a town hall, right on the left-hand side, here are the issues you seem to think are important. And then on the right-hand side, here are the issues I think are important. And then hold it up and say, I see a real disconnect between what we in the audience think is important and what you think is important. And I think it would be an interesting conversation. And I missed one of the most obvious ones, because if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, or you happen to be listening online, my commentary, which we air at about quarter after, is entitled Domestic Enemies. And here's another one we can point out, because I've talked about the fact that the president and the vice president have been delivering speeches arguing that we have a significant number of domestic enemies in this country. But we're not talking about Antifa or Muslim radicals. The domestic enemies are parents that show up in school boards that actually protest some of the things being taught. And I point out that when you hear some of those statements being made, you, of course, yesterday talked about the commentary that where I talked about the Attorney General Merrick Garland even suggesting that maybe we have to have law enforcement investigating these individuals. And the Biden Justice Department now have actually formed a domestic terrorism unit within the Justice Department. And I suspect that most of the people that will be be investigated will not be part of Antifa. And I did notice the other day that Senator Tom Cotton says, he's putting a hold on any other appointments to the Justice Department until at least the Justice Department answers his questions as to why there was not any kind of investigation into the riots by Antifa. So that's as relevant as what's going on in Congress right now. But if I can say one thing that I hear time and time again when we go out and get to meet you, it is so many individuals who have come up to me that listen to Point of View that say, I'm really concerned about the future of this country. This month, I'm going to get on another airplane and going to meet some more of you. And when that takes place, I'll guarantee that that is what I'm going to hear. And one of the commentaries that I have coming out in the future reminds us that if you look at some of the most recent polls, 2/3 of Americans basically feel that America, this country, is on the wrong track. And, of course, a higher percentage, perhaps, of Republicans hold to that. But even so, you can get to 4 in 10, even Democrats that agree with that as well. Now, sometimes for different reasons, but it's a good illustration of why we think that it's going to be all the more important that when people say, I'm really concerned about the future of democracy, say, explain what you mean by that, because what we see is the leaders are convinced that the big threats are transgender issues, equity, climate change, Ukraine. Those are not the ones that you think are important. And, of course, you can put your list. Of course, I didn't put CRT on there or abortion or all sorts of other issues. So, I mean, I'd love to know what you think. But I see, and I'm sure you see as well, a complete disconnect between our leaders and the voting public. Okay, well, the voting public has an opportunity in the midterm elections. You can't necessarily throw everybody out of office, but you could certainly do quite a bit. And at the same time, again, you maybe can't remove people from the media, although they've already decided to take Whoopi Goldberg off the air for 2 weeks. And one individual that's been working with a major news outlet had to step down. So, yes, but you don't have to watch those either. And so those are some thoughts that I would love to maybe provide you with a resource so that you can begin to express your concern and maybe show visually how different some of the people that we have put into office view the world compared to where you are. And we, the people, it says in the Constitution, have the opportunity to bring about some of those changes. But let's go to the whole issue of the border. And the reason I do that is now the editors, for example, of the Wall Street Journal are writing about this. One very well-known writer for Wall Street Journal, Jason Riley, is writing about this, so I thought we'd get back to the topic once again. First of all, this article that comes from the editors reminds us again of body cam video that was unearthed from the Freedom of Information Act that shows an individual in law enforcement in a particular airport near New York City asking federal contractors, why in the world are after hours you're bringing in illegal border crossers into this state? And the contractor says, well, the Department of Department of Homeland Security, I should say, wants everyone on the down low. And you might remember the conversation because the people providing security are saying, wait a minute, you're on a secure facility here and we don't know anything and we're in charge of security. So we're having a real problem here where you're dropping down individuals who actually land in a nondescript airport and a nondescript airplane without any kind of surveillance. And we don't know who these people are, where they came from. And then, of course, a lot of them say, well, that's just the whole secrecy thing. But what's the big secret? The contractor asks, well, everybody knows it's happening. Well, actually, not everybody does know that's happening. But because those videos are getting out, people are learning about what's happening. And in addition to that, you also have other footage coming from, in this case, Texas, down in the Brownsville area, in which you see just lots and lots of single adult males being processed through this, again, nondescript location. flown to cities around the country, and this has been taking place for some time. And so neither of the operations, they say, are caught on video should be happening. The New York flight involved unaccompanied minors, so the administration has portrayed that as a routine transfer in keeping with the William Wilberforce Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. That's a mouthful. The act actually is dealing with the issue of unaccompanied minors being trafficked. But again, the minors being flown to New York don't actually meet the definition of being unaccompanied, since they usually have an illegal immigrant parent or relative in the United States that is paid to get them across the border in the first place. In other words, they're being smuggled, not trafficked, and that's important. And again, even here, the editors understand it would be understandable to want to reunite some of them with their parents, but there is no reason for them even allowing the parents and the families to stay here in the first place. And of course, the single adult releases are even another matter. In a nod to reality, they point out Biden preserved the Trump policy of using what's called Title 42, which is a public health authority, to immediately expel many migrants during the pandemic. But Mexico, of course, will only accept migrants from certain countries. And so the releases are probably from places like Nicaragua, especially Venezuela, that simply can't be returned over the border. And so, again, they should be remaining in Mexico, but that was abandoned till fairly recently, simply because they wanted to reverse every single policy that was implemented by Donald Trump. Well, if you want to look at what that means, even though these videos are basically videos that have been shown primarily on Fox News, there's all the evidence in the world to suggest that people other than Fox News viewers understand the problem. Because if you look at the overall job approval rating right now for the president, it's in the low 40s. But if you look at the place where he has the least approval, and in other words, the most disapproval, it's on how this administration and how he has handled the issue of immigration. It is the lowest value of all of those. So immigration is an issue that a lot of people are certainly concerned about, whether they've seen these videos or not. They know it's happening. They're concerned about it happening. They've seen enough stories about the lack of border security. Unless you think this is just going to, fade away, we're heading into warmer months where that is probably going to increase dramatically. And I'll quote from Reuters that simply reports, quote, "Border officials are preparing for as many as 9,000 border arrests per day by the spring, according to two Department of Homeland Security officials, which would be significantly larger than last year's peak." As Kelly Shackelford shared with us on Friday, we were told during the Obama administration that even 1,000 crossings a day would be considered a crisis. We're now talking about the possibility of 9,000 border arrests, which is not the total number of crossings. It's just the 9,000 a day that will get caught. And you can see that we have a crisis that oftentimes politicians, the mainstream media don't want to talk about. And there's that gap again we've talked about. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, got a lot more to cover. Let me just mention, we do have some articles that we've posted today. One on government evangelical leaders and COVID, which you might want to see. One I'll get to before the end of the hour, if I can. Hispanic students in critical race theory comes from Kelly Fontanilla. Fascinating article, and I think you might want to read it in its entirety. Also mentioned something about Whoopi Goldberg, and in just a minute, I want to get into this meta-analysis that was done by Johns Hopkins University, which really gives us an understanding of what has been taking place in terms of the lockdown. But let's take some phone calls, too. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Alberto first. I would love to get your thoughts on this issue of immigration.
Kerby, I appreciate your program. God bless you for your ministry. I know the importance of what's happening in the southern border. I grew up about 16 miles from Lower Manhattan, which was truly the melting pot, all nationalities and races, and I can tell you that the large percentage of those folks coming to America legally come here seeking and desiring the American dream.
Sure.
But one thing that we're not discussing is what's happening in the waterways of America, places like Puerto Rico, where thousands of immigrants are being arrested and deported by the U.S. Coast Guard as they're being intercepted, trying to get to the U.S. through Puerto Rico. The other thing I'd like to share briefly is we really don't hear much about what's happening on our northern border. Can you share some light in regards to that? Thank you so much.
Well, very good. And again, you've reminded me that we do need to talk about that. I mentioned in passing the other day where you did have the Secretary of Homeland Security saying he was a little concerned about the Cubans coming here. And of course, the reason for that is I think Cubans tend to vote a little more Republican than Democratic, because the hope, I think, on the minds of at least some individuals is by the individuals crossing the border, whether from Mexico or from other Latin American countries, is that they may indeed vote Democratic. But your point's well taken. Whether you look at Puerto Rico, Haiti, even sometimes the Bahamas and Cuba, those are important issues, and we really probably need to do a whole program on immigration. From what I understand, in some respects, the northern border is a little more secure. I've heard all sorts of stories of people that have traveled from the United States into Canada, and it's been difficult to do so. By the way, if you haven't noticed, there's quite a bit of protest right now in Ottawa. You've had all these truckers and all sorts of Canadians upset with Justin Trudeau. But that, in some respects, is a little more of a secure border, although I have seen parts of the Canadian border where there's like a cone where you're supposed to simply drive around it and then register. So there are the potential of individuals, terrorists and others, that could actually find their way into this country through the more porous Canadian border, through places where there isn't a great deal of security. So maybe we just need to get an expert on that, maybe Mark Krikorian or somebody like that, to kind of address the whole issue of immigration, because you raised a very good point. And back to the point that you made a minute ago, you've grown up around people from other countries, and I have a neighborhood right now where we have just a tremendous amount of ethnic diversity, which a good number of people that are in this country, the parents, English is not their first language, but they have come here legally, and they are good citizens, and they are involved in different aspects of outreach and are very good citizens. And I've oftentimes said that an individual that goes through the process of legalization, they will learn a whole lot more about the American government and about our history. And quite frankly, sometimes they make better citizens than those who are born here, because as I've pointed out before, if you look at the attempt in a couple of states to require students who have graduated from high school to pass the citizenship test, they find that a good number of them cannot. So anybody that has been able to come to this country, learn English, if that was not a language they already knew, then learn our history, learn about our government, raise their right hand, and want to pledge to be good American citizens, they sometimes are the best citizens we can find. So again, you've raised some really good questions, and maybe we'll just do a whole program here in the future on the subject of immigration and border security. But just before we run out of time, I did, for just a few minutes, want to summarize, and I do mean summarize, this very long and detailed report that comes from Johns Hopkins University. And again, sometimes when you hear experts, you roll your eyes. Well, this is where a lot of the good research has been done, and they were the ones really giving us some documentation for what was happening during COVID. And I thought I would just real quickly have them say a few of the points. And first of all, they say we can conclude, they say, that the lockdowns are not an effective way of reducing mortality rates during the pandemic, at least not during the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic. Our results are in line with the World Health Organization, also that states that reports from the 1918 influenza pandemic indicate that social distancing measures did not stop or appear to dramatically reduce transmission. And then they talk about some other examples. For example, in Edmonton, Canada, isolation and quarantine were instituted, public meetings were banned, schools, churches, college, theaters, and other public gathering places were closed. And they go all the way down and said that it really doesn't show that the lockdowns had much effect, marginal effect at best. So before I take some more phone calls and get into a couple other issues, let's try to answer the three questions that they tried to address through this very long and detailed study. First of all, why was this the case, that the lockdowns did not work? And the Johns Hopkins researchers said, quote, mandates only regulate a fraction of our potential contagious contacts and can hardly regulate nor enforce hand washing, coughing etiquette, distancing in supermarkets. They go on to say that countries like Denmark, Finland, and Norway that realized success in keeping COVID mortality rates relatively low allowed people to go to work, use public transportation, meet privately at home during the first lockdown. In these countries, there were ample opportunities to legally meet with others. And the point is that some of those which had very few lockdowns, sometimes they had a spike early on, but then it didn't make any difference. The lockdowns just moved the spike a few months back. The second question is, okay, how much harm came from these lockdowns? And the argument from the researchers at Johns Hopkins were, quote, unintended consequences may play a larger role than recognized. We already pointed to the possible unintended consequences of some of these actions, but by isolating an infected person at home with his or her family while he or she risks infecting family members with a higher viral load, causing more severe interest. But often lockdowns have limited people's access to safe outdoor places such as beaches, parks, and zoos, or included outdoor mask mandates or strict outdoor gathering restrictions, pushing people to meet at less safe indoor places. And so again, talking about it ultimately has tremendous negative consequences. So first of all, why does it not work? Well, it maybe just moves the issue further down. I've said sometimes, like, if you want to talk about Russian roulette, it's like the difference between having two bullets in the chamber and one. But if you pull the trigger enough, doesn't matter whether you have one bullet or two, sooner or later the gun's going to go off. It's a bad analogy, but I think you illustrate the point that if people are going to get sick, by sequestering them for a while, you will postpone people getting sick. But eventually they're going to get sick because sooner or later those lockdowns will stop. And the last point, and this one perhaps is the most significant, what lessons can be learned? And again, I'm summarizing a really long study, but it's a meta-analysis. I think it's really kind of the gold standard in terms of looking at medical health. They said, quote, the use of lockdowns is a unique feature of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns have not been used to such a large extent during any of the pandemics of the past century. However, lockdowns during the initial phase of COVID-19 pandemic had devastating effects. Here they are. They have contributed to reducing economic activity, raising unemployment, reducing schooling, causing political unrest, contributing to domestic violence, and undermining liberal democracy. These costs to society must be compared to the benefits of lockdowns, which our meta-analysis has shown are marginal at best. Such a standard benefit cost calculation leads to a strong conclusion. Lockdown should be rejected out of hand as a pandemic policy instrument. Well, again, I would have to say that as much time and effort was done by Johns Hopkins University, in some respects, it reminds me of the book that we talked about more than a year and a half ago with Dr. Jay Richards and others that basically came to the same conclusion, that the lockdowns and the mandates had a marginal or relatively insignificant impact, but the costs were enormous, and I think we've all figured that out as well. Let's take a break, though. We'll take some more phone calls, and I want to get into this whole idea, if we can, of the reaction from even Hispanic students to the issue of critical race theory. Fascinating little piece, and before we're done, we'll try to cover just a couple of other issues in the news, but if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back and take some phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let's see if we can take some phone calls. So we'll head out to New Mexico. KPCL, Keith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for taking my call today, and I appreciate the Point of View radio station. I listen to you every day, and you was talking about the immigration situation. I was raised on the New Mexico border all my life. I've known lots of Spanish-speaking people that have come across and have become citizens of the United States. And like you was talking before, those people become very good citizens. They understand our country, the bylaws, and the work ethics that we have in this country. And my hat's off to those people. But with all of the other rhetoric that's going on in the rest of the world right now, I also had a friend that was a retired ICE officer that worked the Mexican border. And one of the things that was alarm to the rest of the people in the country is there's a lot of people that's coming across the Mexican border. They're coming in from all the way down the bottom end of Mexico and crossing our borders. But most of these people don't care nothing about becoming American citizens. What they're doing, they're coming into this country as terrorists. And the people that are crossing, they're packing backpacks full of bombs and things of that nature. And it's just a sad deal that's going on. But it's like I say, you're only as strong as the weakest link that's in your chain. And our weakest link is on the Mexican border down there in that country, all the way into Texas and Arizona. And my hat's off to those people that have been putting up with this. But the people in the United States need to be aware of what's going on. It's not necessarily the Mexican people, but it's all the other immigrants that are coming from other countries that mean to do us harm instead of become a part of our great society that we have in the United States. Those are the statements that I have, and I thank you, sir, for doing the job that you're doing.
Well, thank you for calling in and listening every day. And again, I would say that the number of people that intend us harm may be a fraction of a percent, but still, even if it's like 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000, you don't want those people coming through. And the bottom line is that we recognize that there are a number of people that do come to this country because they are seeking a better life. I don't dismiss that at all. I understand that if I were in the same situation, I'd want to come here. But when you look at what is happening on the border, and I think Keith gives us a little bit of a feel for that, whether it's the drug cartels and drug smuggling or human trafficking, whether it's those individuals where we sometimes pick up these backpacks at the border, and some of the backpacks are in Spanish, but some of the backpacks have everything written in Arabic. And I always use the example of the one backpack they pick up, and it's got a complete blueprint of a nuclear facility. Now, you got to think, I don't think they came across the border because they wanted to work in a nuclear facility. I wonder what indeed they had in mind. And it only takes one. It only takes 1 out of 1,000. And so even though most of the individuals want to have a better life, we also understand that what they do is as they cross over the border, they're sort of jumping in line. I've used this illustration before in our booklet on immigration. If you're standing in line, the grocery store, standing in line to go into a movie, and somebody cuts in front of you, go, wait a minute, get back in the back of your line. You don't cut in front of me. And yet we allow this to happen when we have people all over the world who are trying to go through the legal process of coming to this country and becoming citizens. And they may be in Hong Kong. They may be in Uganda. They may be in India or Pakistan. They may be in Argentina, or they may be coming from the UK or from Canada or Germany, wherever. And they are those who are following the rules, the rule of law, and are working so that eventually they could come to this country and be good citizens. And they find themselves sometimes shoved to the back of the line by the people that just walk across the border or show up here legally and overstay their visas. The estimates were at one time that 40% of the people here illegally actually came here legally, but then stayed. They overstayed their visas, or they jump on a ship and get off the ship. And, whatever it might be, there are all sorts of different places. But Keith was talking about the porous southern border. And many of you listening to this say, well, doesn't affect me, because after all, I don't live in California or New Mexico or Arizona or Texas. Most of them come through Texas. But now I think we've documented, and we've talked about these videos that show, but then they just load those people up and they fly them to all sorts of places around the country. And so not only are those particular states border states, but essentially if you're in the continental United States, you're a border state too. And that's a real concern. Let me wind down real quickly by mentioning that this piece that is actually a description that comes from Callie Fontanilla. She is actually of Jamaican ancestry, but she was an English language teacher working in Salinas, California. And if you've grown up in California, you know that primarily what she was dealing with were majority Mexican population. And she was basically teaching them English as a second language. But she began to notice that all of her students were failing a class, and the class was ethnic studies. Well, you kind of know where this is going, because it turns out that as she looked at the course syllabus and she looked at some of the things online, what they were teaching there was critical race theory, and these students didn't really like it. They were forced basically to learn the 4 I's of oppression. Those were institutional, internalized, ideological, and interpersonal oppression. And as a result, she said, the kids didn't like the stuff. They didn't do well. Most of them were saying, why do we have to take this class? Because they had been taking a very popular health class, and now you see that even these students who would be considered to be minority students, people of color, they were rejecting and reacting negatively to the whole issue of critical race theory. And it's a fascinating story. I don't really have the time to go through it, but we've posted it for you to read to illustrate the fact that this isn't just an issue that some white students are getting upset about critical race theory, or even the conversation we had with Ryan Bomberger, who is a person of color as well, upset about critical race theory and testifying at the Loudoun County school board meetings and things of that nature. This is an ongoing issue that certainly is causing all sorts of tension and racial strife that doesn't need to take place. Just before we're done, I have posted a very good article, Whoopi Goldberg suspended by ABC. We may not like some of the things that individuals say. You may not like all the things Joe Rogan says or the people that he interviews. You may not like some of the comments made on The View. I don't. But the point is that especially in something like The View, which is really kind of a platform for opinion, people can express an opinion, even if it's a stupid one, and this one has to do with trying to say that Jews aren't really a racial minority, please, and then being accused of anti-Semitism. I don't think she's anti-Semitic, but the bottom line is here, once again, the solution is, well, let's just suspend her for 2 weeks. Of course, the push is to even get her fired. The attempt is to try to get rid of Joe Rogan, and I believe in free speech, even when I disagree with a speech. Matter of fact, that's the best time to support free speech, when you disagree with it, because ultimately, if we can suspend individuals for making a statement that I dislike, or one that is even seen as somewhat harmful, but I can suspend you as well. And so I think we should be on the very forefront of speaking out for the rights of individuals, whether we agree with them or not, to speak their mind, and she was certainly within her rights to do so, even though we might disagree with some of the things she says. That's my thought, but again, that article goes into it in some detail, and you might want to read it as well. We're out of time before we're out of topics, but that's usually the case. So let me encourage you to go to the website. You can find out more about what Reverend Percy McCray is doing, what Ryan Bomberger is doing, and you can read some of the articles we've posted today, all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let me thank again Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve as his help, along with our intern today as a producer, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.